Let's react.
This is the sound that defined a decade.
The hurt doesn't show, but the pain still grows. Some strangers to you and me.
Okay, you already felt it. You don't even need the drum fill. You just need those first few seconds. And suddenly, you're in the 80s, the magical 80s. Neon lights, shoulder pads, late night TV glow, someone dramatically staring out of a rainy window. That's the thing about Phil Collins. He doesn't just sound like the 80s. He is the 80s. And I don't mean that as a joke. I mean that in the most respectful way possibly. Let's talk about how this even happened. Because Phil Collins didn't start the 80s as some pop superstar. He was the drummer in Genesis. Genesis was a progressive rock band. Weird time signatures, long songs, concept albums, not exactly MTV territory. And then somehow, this quiet, slightly awkward, bolden drummer ends up defining the entire decade. How? First of all, the voice. Phil Collins doesn't have a huge, operatic, dramatic voice. It's not Freddie Mercury. It's not Robert Plant. It's human. It sounds like a guy you might know. But here's the trick. It's emotional. When Phil sings, it sounds like he means it. Even if he's singing something simple, even if it's pop, it doesn't feel fake. And in the 80s, when production was getting bigger and shinier, that emotional directness cut through. Now, let's talk about that drum sound. Because we have to. That gated reverb, that massive thunderclap snare, that boom, that sounds like it was recorded inside a metal warehouse in outer space. That wasn't an accident, that was innovation, and suddenly every producer in the 80s heard it and thought, yeah, that, more of that. So what happens? Phil Collins' drum sound spreads everywhere. Suddenly the 80s sound like Phil Collins, even when Phil Collins isn't there. That's when you know you've defined something. Let's go back to In the Air Tonight, that drum fill. You know, that one. I don't even have to say what I'll say. It's probably already played in your head. That fill is one of the most famous drum moments in music history.
Do it.
And the crazy part? It's simple. It's not a 400 note technical explosion, so to say. It's space, it's tension, it's restraint, and then release. And that's what the 80s loved. Drama. Build up. A big payoff. Phil Collins understood that instinctively. Then you've got songs like Against All Odds. Beautiful song. That's not subtle, that's emotional. Full volume heartbreak. And somehow it works without feeling cheesy. Well, okay, maybe slightly cheesy, I don't know. But in the best way possible. The 80s didn't fear emotion, they leaned into it. And Phil leaned right with them. Here's something funny. Phil Collins doesn't look like a typical 80s icon. He's not glam, he's not mysterious, he's not leather and eyeliner. He looks like your accountant who happens to own a drum kit and can't sing. And that made it even better because he felt accessible. He felt normal. And when normal people sing about love, loss, regrets, it feels relatable. Let's not forget Susudio. Susudio. Now, listen. We all know Susudio is pure 80s. Horn stabs, bright production, energy for days. It's funky. Is it deep? Well, not particularly. Is it catchy? Absolutely. And that's another reason Phil Collins became the sound of the decade. He could do both. Moody, serious, and then, suddenly, bright pop fun. That range mirrors the 80s perfectly. The decade wasn't one thing. It was excess and introspection at the same time. And somehow Phil Collins did both without it feeling weird. Now, we have to talk about No Jacket Required. This album basically leaped on the radio. You couldn't escape from it. You heard Phil Collins in the car, then in a shop, then in a movie, then on MTV, then again at home. And here's the important part. People didn't get tired of him. That's rare. Overexposure usually kills artists, but Phil Collins had that steady, dependable energy. He wasn't controversial, he wasn't scandal driven, he was just there. And in a chaotic decade, that stability helped. Also, and this is important, he was everywhere without being annoying. And that's a skill. Some artists feel forced, Phil didn't. He felt natural, like the 80s just happened to line up with his instincts. Now, let's zoom out. What defines the 80s musically? Big drums, clean but bold production, emotional ballads, synth textures, strong hooks. Phil Collins ticks every of these boxes. He was part of shaping them. When he produced, when he collaborated, when he played drums for other artists, his fingerprints were there. And those fingerprints became the decade. There's also the film side. You Can't Hurry Love, soundtracks, TV moments, he became part of pop culture. Not just music. When your voice becomes background music for people's lives, you become timeless. And here's something I genuinely admire about Phil Collins. Phil never tried to act cooler than he was. He didn't pretend to be edgy. He didn't pretend to be mysterious. He was upfront, sometimes awkward, sometimes intense, sometimes overly sincere. And that sincerity defined the decade because the 80s weren't subtle, they were dramatic. And Phil matched that energy perfectly. Let's talk about the other side, ballads. When Phil sings a ballad, it feels personal, not theatrical, not overacted, just honest. And that honesty grounded the big production. Without that emotional anchor, 80s production can feel empty. With Phil's voice, it feels real. And we can't ignore his Genesis crossover. When Genesis shifted from progressive rock to more accessible pop, Phil's voice became the bridge. He carried complexity into mainstream without losing identity. And that's not easy.
Every time that I look at you, but I can see the future. 'Cause you know I know.
The truth is, Phil Collins didn't just ride the 80s wave, he helped design it. That drum style, that vocal style, that emotional openness, that blend of pop and seriousness, he became the template. And once you become the template, you're no longer just part of a decade, you define it. Now, here's the funny part. When people imitate the 80s today, they're usually imitating Phil Collins, even if they don't realize it. The big snare, the dramatic pulse, the heartfelt delivery, it's in there. So why did Phil Collins become the sound of the 80s? Because he understood scale, he understood restraint, he understood melody, he understood drama, and most importantly, he understood feeling. The 80s were bold, Phil was bold. The 80s were emotional, Phil was emotional. The 80s were huge, Phil's drums were huge. It lined up perfectly. And maybe that's the real answer. Sometimes an artist doesn't chase a decade, they arrive at exactly the right moment with exactly the right instincts. And suddenly, everything fits. Phil Collins didn't force himself into the 80s, he just was the 80s. And once that connection was made, there was no separating them. Put on In the Air Tonight, put on Against All Odds, put on Susudio. You're not just hearing songs, you're hearing a time capsule. And at the center of it, Phil Collins, calm, serious, slightly awkward, absolutely iconic. I love Phil Collins. And as you all know, he's not feeling too great this last few years, and that's so sad to see. And I'm saying a prayer for Phil Collins. I hope he gets stronger by the day. He's made so many of us so happy, and he deserves some happiness, especially in his later years in life. And Phil, I wish you well. I hope you enjoyed it. There's membership as well available where you help decide what we talk about next. And you can check that out. If you're yet to subscribe, please don't forget to do so. It's Harry. Stay cool, stay good. I'll see you later. Bye.